I'm Michelle Kaffenberger, and I'm a research fellow with the RISE program at the University of Oxford. This is the second out of 3 lectures in this unit, and in this one I'll be introducing the concept of learning trajectories. So in the first lecture, I showed a lot of data points that describe and illustrate the global learning crisis. Most of these came from point-in-time assessments, giving a snapshot of learning levels among children in a variety of countries and contexts. In this lecture, I'm going to introduce the concept of the learning trajectory as an analytic and diagnostic tool for education systems analysis. Learning trajectories are beneficial as they show the dynamics of children's learning as they progress through school, and as such can inform policy priorities in a number of areas. I also want to note that sometimes learning trajectories are called learning profiles, including in some of the papers that I'll reference, but just want to note that those terms are meant to be synonymous in this context. So why are learning trajectories useful? Well, children got to where they are through some process of learning or not over multiple years. Cross-sections of a single age or grade don't show the dynamics of the progression of learning that children went through across ages or grades. So, for example, the World Bank's Learning Poverty Measure, which I talked about in the last lecture, is for children at age 10, just one point in time. This is a super useful measure, but it doesn't tell you anything about the dynamics of how children got to where they are, or where they're going to go after the age of 10 in terms of learning outcomes. Furthermore, assessments at later grades, even primary leaving exams just at the end of primary school, can be too late in the cycle to show when children begin to fall behind. As another example, drawing on my last lecture, the PISA-D assessment is at age 15, one point in time and late in the schooling cycle. This is far too late to catch if children have not learned to read. If they're not learning basic foundations, we need to catch that much earlier so they can catch up and engage in later learning. Finally, data only on children in school give no information on learning among those who have dropped out or never started school. Data on all children is needed for understanding progression on equity goals or goals for universal achievement. So learning trajectories help to fill these gaps. Learning trajectories describe how much children learn over time in a specific context. This illustrative graph shows learning on the y-axis. This could be any measure of learning, literacy or mathematics, or skills like piano or tennis or learning to ride your bike. And the x-axis shows the amount of time children or adults spend engaged in that learning. To put it a little bit more formally, learning trajectories are the empirical association between years of schooling and learning achieved. They show the dynamics of children's learning as they progress through school. They represent the link between schooling and learning. So as children or adults progress across time on the x-axis in this figure, their learning levels will also vary on the y-axis. If they're in school and learning, their learning trajectory will be upward sloping. If they have stopped learning new content, their learning trajectory for that topic will flatten off. And if they start to forget content or a skill, the trajectory can actually turn downward sloping. For example, I spent a few semesters as an undergraduate studying forensic chemistry. After switching majors, my learning trajectory immediately turned steeply downward sloping, and now it would be near zero and flat for those chemistry topics that I have long since forgotten. For children, we would hope that their learning trajectories would be mostly upward sloping for most subjects throughout their schooling. So how are learning trajectories different from business as usual assessments of learning? While they seem deceptively simple, learning trajectories offer a very different way to think about learning. So some of these points I've mentioned already, but this table shows how they directly compare and contrast with many typical sources of learning data, such as most national, regional, or international assessments. So learning trajectories cover learning across multiple ages or grades, versus most typical sources of learning data focus on just a single or just a couple ages or grades. Learning trajectories also focus on learning as a process, focusing on the dynamics over time, whereas most typical sources of learning data focus on learning as an outcome at a single point in time. Furthermore, learning trajectories typically cover earlier years in schooling than what's captured in most typical sources of learning data. Versus, again, in most national, regional, or international assessments, these tend to happen later in the schooling cycle. And analyzing learning in the early years is especially important for identifying when children begin to fall behind, and hence where we should focus energy and resources on steepening their learning. And then finally, learning trajectories tend to cover children who have dropped out or never started school by using household-based assessments, whereas a lot of typical sources of learning data use school-based assessments and only include children who are in school. And again, measuring learning among children who are out of school is critical for understanding progress on universal learning goals, such as the Sustainable Development Goals, which call for all children to gain foundational skills. So the kinds of data needed to analyze learning trajectories have become much more widely available in recent years. The main thing that's needed is a standardized measure of learning for different levels of schooling completion. Appropriate types of data take a few different forms. The first type is called contemporaneous cross-sections, which sounds complicated, but it just means assessments of children. This would involve administering assessments to children who are different ages or in different grades. And it provides a snapshot of the learning dynamics in the current education system. Children who are currently learning or in school or out of school and showing what their learning levels are. Multiple cross-sections allow you to see how learning trajectories change over time. And there's a few examples of this type of data in the table there. The second main type of data that's analyzed for these are called retrospective cross-sections, which also sounds complicated, but that just means assessments of adults based on their highest level of schooling. This involves administering the same assessment or a linked assessment to adults who've completed different levels of schooling. This provides a snapshot of learning dynamics in the past, but if it's young adults, it can be the recent past. And this has some benefits because these are young adults who have completed their schooling, so we know kind of their end outcome in terms of learning. And it also captures how much learning they've retained into adulthood. Children can memorize content in order to pass a test and quickly forget that content. So assessing adults provides information on how much has been retained and therefore is kind of functional learning that's taken into adulthood. And then finally, panel data follows the same children over time. This involves administering assessments that are linked from one year to the next. And it allows us to track how learning is actually developing as children progress through school. These are quite costly and time-intensive though, so relative to the other two types, they're relatively rare, especially in low and middle income countries. But one benefit of this type is that they allow us to see how learning differs for children who start at different points in the learning distribution. So do low performers tend to catch up to initially higher performers? Do they tend to fall further behind? Etc. These kinds of questions can be answered with panel data. So for many countries, data already exists and simply has to be analyzed in this way. So how are learning trajectories used? They're used in a few different main ways. So one way learning trajectories are used is to answer questions such as, how much does the average child's learning increase from one grade to the next? So on some kind of scale or measure, how much do children tend to learn? Another type of question is, how severe is the learning crisis in different countries? How much variation is there between countries? So we can look at, which countries lag behind, which countries are doing quite well and maybe could serve as examples for other countries to learn from. Another type of question is, how much variation is there in learning within countries? So do certain groups, such as girls or the poor, tend to lag behind other groups or not? And finally, questions like, when do children and countries start to fall behind? When do their learning trajectories begin to flatten out? So in this figure, you can see that Nepal, for example, has an upward sloping learning trajectory across all 9 grades, while DRC remains almost completely flat on this measure of numeracy. On average, across the 26 countries, the learning trajectory begins to flatten off after about grades 5 or 6, with less than half of children gaining basic numeracy by grade 9. A second way that learning trajectories are used is to map progress towards learning goals. So learning outcomes are just the combination of years in school and amount learned per year. So education systems that are trying to improve outcomes can either focus on extending the learning trajectory as more years of schooling, making that learning trajectory longer across more grades, or by steepening the learning trajectory, which would be increasing learning per year. Analysis of learning trajectories is really important in these decision-making processes because if the learning trajectory flattens off, like the orangish-brown one in this diagram, then more years of schooling will not reach learning outcome goals. In most countries, steeper learning is needed, like the blue line. But you need to analyze learning trajectories to understand these dynamics in a particular context because it does vary. Building on that analysis, learning trajectories then also enable simulation of different policy approaches. They allow us to simulate how much learning could be gained from increasing average years of schooling, from extending that learning trajectory. They also allow us to simulate how much could be gained from steepening learning trajectories by some reasonable amount. And they allow simulation of different equality targets. So a lot of focus today is given to achieving equality across groups, especially in girls' education, as well as equality by SES, etc. Learning trajectories let us simulate how much learning outcomes would change in scenarios of equality. So for example, in this figure, you can just see visually that the difference in learning achievement between girls and boys is very, very small, while the gap to universal skills is very large. This suggests that focusing on equality per se would not be very effective at reaching goals of universal skills. Instead, the focus in this context should be on improving outcomes for all children. Learning trajectories enable further and more in-depth analysis of scenarios like that one. So in conclusion, this has been just a very brief overview of learning trajectories, their uses, and their data requirements. And the next lecture will cover examples and findings from learning trajectories analysis. Thank you very much.